We're back. Did you miss us? We hope so. The world has moved on in the 2 weeks since I went up into the mountains and hung out in old Spain or New Spain for a bit. I don't know what Kilt has been doing. we assume those people down under continue to have lives when we don't pay attention to them, right? Maybe. We need to talk about some stuff that I think we've been skirting around and knowing that we need to talk about and wishing we didn't have to talk about, because people tend to get anxious when we talk about these things, like, oh, I don't know, devotion to Mary. You know, that's always part of it. But now that we've dealt with Barbie and Ken and what were we made for, the Ark recognizes that we have to address the elephant in the room, which is, how do you persuade people to be Christian? Or to recognize the necessity for being Christian in the circumstances in which we find ourselves as fallen creatures. And to do that, we're going to have to address some of the questions that people have about why they aren't Christian. And if that's not indirect, I don't know what's going to get you interested. Welcome to the Mosaic Ark. So you're looking stuff up because you have no idea what we're talking about either, right?
No idea.
Those,
it's so vague. I still don't know.
It's the fog that we have to project in order to talk about certain topics. It's like, I mean, we did the fashion show last year about this time. That famous fashion show where there was a T-shirt with a picture of the Pope on the front in Spanish. I think that was really important.
Yes, the White Lives Matter T-shirt.
Was that what it was about? Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! Whiteness still seems to be in the news, in the discussion, in the internets, on the social media.
It does.
Quite. If you put the H first, it's like white. I'm going with blonde fragility. I think we should just stick with Ken. I don't want to do this. Why did you make I'm going to blame her because I just don't. You've been having some interesting conversations in the press, making those sandwiches for people over the last couple of weeks, while I've been hiding out in the mountains trying to increase my remembrance of Spanish. I do actually. So since I grew up, we said this in the newsletter for DCR. Whenever we kept doing the newsletters, right? So you guys, if you're not subscribed to the newsletter and you want to keep up with where the Mosaic Ark is not when we're not streaming, last week I was on the mountain and I was looking at the mountain that I grew up under and reflecting a little bit on how strange it is that I grew up where I did, and therefore that people, get upset with me for things that they probably don't appreciate. It's like, why would she not have the ideas that we expect her to have? Because isn't she white?
Is she?
Well, yeah, I mean, according to the standard Anglo narrative that we're also trying to unpack. So I was listening to E. Michael Jones talk about Oppenheimer. And of course, Oppenheimer was much on my mind, even though I haven't seen the movie and have zero intention of watching it. Because, oh, right, the mountain I was on also, you could look in the other direction and see the mountain where Oppenheimer and company made that bomb. Out there in New Mexico, right? It's like my family history is very, very strange because we show up. My dad takes my mom and me, because there was just me at that point, baby, less than 6 months old, and we show up in Albuquerque underneath Sandia Mountain because the national labs were hiring people, and my uncle, who my dad's brother-in-law, worked at the Los Alamos labs by that point. This is the mid-60s. And so it's like I feel so caught up. My family history is everywhere, right? We've got the pirates, we got the bomb makers.
Yeah.
And the place where they assemble the bombs is actually where you and I streamed from last, which is the town in Texas where my mom lives. Also has helium deposits there. It's like the West, this desert in the West is where all of these stories come from. But the other thing that comes from that region is, of course, Hispanic. And so I always feel very much at home when all the street signs are in Spanish.
Like going home to the land of enchantment.
I do. Yes, I've got some more jewelry, right? It's like I've got, and I loved flashing my cuffs when I was looking around to all the jewelry shops in Santa Fe, because of course I've been longing for that jewelry since I was. Well, the thing is, I did actually tell one of the guards. I was in the art museum and sort of strolling about looking at glass. There was a really interesting glass exhibit in wood, Santos, the carved images of Our Lady and the saints. And I had a seat, and one of the guards came around and saying, as they do, is that they're in the tourist greeting mode. It's like, is this your first time in Santa Fe? I'm like, how old are you? I said to the guard, and he looked at me, he's like 56. And I'm like, I was here before you were. Just a little bit, right? But I know I was in Santa Fe as a baby. So yes. It's like the deepest memory roots that I have, not St. Louis where I was born, because I really can't remember anything before I was 6 months old. But the deepest memory roots I have are in the land of enchantment in New Mexico. And therefore the deepest history roots I have consciously of my own are the stories of the Spanish and the Pueblo and the sort of images and mysteries that are involved in how that part of the world isn't actually part of Mexico. That was when we moved from New Mexico to Kentucky. When I was there was a few moves in there and such, but I was in 4th grade, and the kids in Kentucky were all saying, "Where are you from?" And we're like, "From New Mexico." And they're like, "Are you American?" It's a fair question.
So you've emerged from the border of America and Spain, really, in this strange cultural isthmus that is
yet again. And of course, one of the things that the guides, for example, I didn't go to the Palace of the Governor's exhibit this time because I've seen it before and I'm not sure whether it's changed. But anyway, one of the things that they show there is, of course, also there were Spanish there and there were Pueblos there, but there's also a very deep-rooted history of Jews there. Because Spain, right, you think, oh, wait, it's Spain, right? Didn't they kick all their Jews out? And it's like, well, it's complicated.
It's always complicated.
Yeah, so I mean, we're just like there are always all of these stories, and it's some part of me I recognize I'm just kind of weary of having to remind people again of how complicated all these histories are. And so, when I go on social media and see people arguing stupid things like about, I mean, one of the things you're quite diligent on in the press is pointing out that simple Darwinian racism doesn't help us make sense of anything. except for the eugenic programs of the 20th century. But that's another matter. It's the Darwinian eugenics create this fiction of racial purity, which fits nothing of history that we know enough. We've talked in the arc. When I've lost track of which version of which thread we were doing, but the Boers in South Africa against the Anglos, right? And so I'm out there in Santa Fe, remembering, of course, all of the things that I grew up with, and therefore looking for my own memory roots, and conscious of the degree to which the English language historiography of what the Spanish were like in the New World is distorted by the English need to assert dominance over the Spanish empire and conquer it, which is why, of course, New Mexico is part of the United States and not Mexico. Even though the oldest statue of Our Lady in the United States is there in Santa Fe, brought by the Spanish in the 17th century.
So we have
We're going to get to Our Lady tonight, don't worry.
So we have in New Mexico this this beautiful little scene of imperial wars, a contest between the imperial powers, Anglo versus Spanish, and the complexity of how things emerge in those contests. And yeah, I've been hammering the Darwinism, which would be linked to this also, because the Darwinism that people are using now to try and carve out some sense of meaning for themselves, I think it dies in places like New Mexico, really. I mean, and there's a lot of these different places all over the world where the imperial borders are cracking up against each other and then merging in some cases. So I think it's appropriate that the oldest statue of Our Lady in America is in this kind of place, in this place where the Darwinism is lost to different kinds of ways of people's different kinds of genesis of people's identities and where they're coming from.
Yes, well, her name is La Conquistadora. When I saw her last week, she was dressed in a I'd say it was an Indian dress. It's like I think it's Navajo designs, but I'm not sure. But it was she's got different dresses, and this one was a native dress, although the statue itself is Spanish, from Spain. She's in a city that's named for St. Francis of Assisi, Italian. There because was brought by the Spanish in a cathedral church that was built under Jean-Baptiste Lamy, who was French. Although I think the decoration in the church is in English, so it's really confusing. It's like you have all of these different cultures in that one church, in that one building. And then while I was there, the pianist was practicing for some concerts, and he's playing Bach, right? It's like, define this culture.
Let's just add some more in there.
And then one of the really nice restaurants. It's a cafe nearby the cathedral, is a French cafe, so they have pastries and such, decorated in Southwestern style, staffed by locals who are both Hispanic and Pueblo, and the Anglos are there because they're all buying art and jewelry, and so, it's how do you explain to people from outside of that region, what our borders have been complicated and porous for centuries, because the people that live in the south of New Mexico have been going back and forth across the Rio Grande for some time. It's always a border region. It's not going to be a simple absorbed into Boston story. Yeah. And so I do get somewhat impatient. I was also thinking, it's like I get impatient because I feel like we've been talking about this all year. Why hasn't everybody heard us? And then I drove back along Route 66 and sort of waved at the bears and their beartaria on the way home, because the route that we take to get there is right through the middle of the other parts of the border story that I'm familiar with. And I'm getting, I was like, just like my friend, I feel like I should be able to magically speak and people understand. It's not working.
You mean the power of speech should communicate ideas and truths, really simply?
Sometimes. I think sometimes. And instead, we're back on, doesn't it feel like we've gotten stuck, right? We're still arguing the same things over and over and over again. We need. Yeah,
it's like it's Groundhog Day.
Yes, I feel like there's a certain degree of Groundhog Day, and it's like, are we having the argument again about words that we are allowed and not allowed to say, and ideas that we are allowed and not allowed to express, and histories that we are allowed and not allowed to question and consider and understand in their complexity. And oh, by the way, maybe the guys that you thought were the good guys were telling a story themselves that it was all too vague.
Well, I had a thought as you're saying this.
How are we going to get it? How are we going to crack this egg?
The dynamics there in New Mexico that you've described in this church and in this community, it's like a Creole of the Catholic world in the shadow of Oppenheimer's bomb.
Yep.
And I think people are not listening to us. I don't know why. But it seems like people are not listening to us because of the bomb. Because this terrifying technological power that Oppenheimer and everybody that collaborated with him created, think of it as a kind of metaphor for empire itself. I mean, that was like the height of American ingenuity, the creation of that bomb. That's the height of that was the most powerful weapon that they'd ever created. They'd claimed to be able to
become destroyer of worlds, quotes Oppenheimer. Yeah,
exactly.
Your cock is agreeing in the background there. I can hear it.
Oh yeah. Oh god.
Your rooster says, yes, we've hit the nail here. You're right. Keep going.
Talk about destroying eggs. He's been on a rampage last week.
Of my various souvenirs that I found, I think it's in honor of your rooster, a rainbow bead rooster that's now on my keychain.
Yes. Yeah, we need more loud and proud cockerels.
Okay, so the bomb. So I'm there in Santa Fe, surrounded by my own memories, by this complexity of history of the Catholic up against the native. Yeah. And the native is very present there in the art world, although most of the people are Catholic. So I'm in a shop and talking about the shop girl is doing her salesmanship duty, saying, are you new here? And I'm like, no. I bought something from you a few years ago, so that's why I'm here looking again. And so she's trying to make, are you going to, she asked me, Zozobra. Okay, while everybody was drowning at Burning Man, in Santa Fe last weekend, they have their own little Burning Man thing, which is the burning of this. I think it's a shorter statue than the Burning Man statue, but a similar kind of thing. This horrible clown thing that they fill with bad things, right? Divorce papers and parking tickets and all sorts of things, and then set it on fire. And there's a fire dancer, and I've never seen it. I was actually not aware of it until this year, but apparently they've been doing it forever since the 20s. Which means it's when people talk about it, it's like, oh yes, it's an ancient tradition. It's like, yeah, it was invented by some artist in the 20s to burn up, and she's describing it to me, and I said, well, that's very interesting. They should go to confession, don't you think? And she agreed with me. So there's the other layer, of course, of what happens in New Mexico is this overlay of the New Age on top of the ancient. The truly ancient local traditions of the Hopi and the Navajo and so forth, and then the Catholic, which is the ancient, Christian European blending with the local, and then the New Age, which came with a lot of the Anglo, all of it mixed up with whatever happened because of that bomb.
Yeah. What happened with that bomb? The big magic.
The big magic, yeah.
The big magic. Yeah, the big American magic. So
that big American magic, which makes it impossible for us to talk plainly about anything.
Yeah. Well, how can you? How can you speak plainly in an empire that creates that level of big magic?
Yeah.
You can't. It's a kind of spiritual terrorism that has been kind of released there in New Mexico as a. It's the claim of matter over spirit, isn't it? I mean, it's the claim that the control of matter is the most potent weapon that mankind can possess, and it's sort of like in a direct contrast to Our Lady being there in New Mexico. There's the weaponry of the spirit versus the weaponry of dead matter. America, the big magic men in America have, conjured. Other people would say they worked it out with physics calculations, but
Well, we know better. We know that magical mathematics is also a form of manipulation. Yes. So we have our first super chat. They call me Cordell. Says, just bailed from Owen stream and right into a Logos and History stream. We're continuity. There's continuity. Welcome. Yes, welcome. Right, and this I do find it interesting. Yet again, I'm tired of getting into trouble for saying things that just seem so plain to me. The plain things I've said, for example, in my book, which we're going to be talking from a little bit once we get to the Mary part of this. It's like that in Mary and the Art of Prayer, I'm trying to show that there's an ancient tradition that carries on through the Middle Ages in Europe and arguably well into the presence of La Conquistadora in Spain, because one of the other things that's associated with that region is something I point to at the end of Mary and the Art of Prayer, the visions of Sor Maria de Jesus de Agreda, who, however she had visions, and people in the region around where my mom is and also in Santa Fe reported having seen some kind of vision of a lady come to teach them about Christ, about the, salvation, and they show up in Santa Fe wanting to be baptized because they've been talking to her over in Texas, and um, I've lost my thread there. That Sor Maria,
Well,
as I show at the end of my book, she's participating in this very, very ancient understanding of Our Lady as, I mean, the temple where God is present, right? And so I think what you've just put together for me is like in my whole life, all of these things have been jumbled together. The bomb and Mary, the bomb and Mary, the bomb and Mary. It's like, it's almost like Henry Adams and the Virgin and the Dynamo, right? This mechanical
yes.
energy,
Yeah.
this force that creates the modern world with electricity, and then the atomic bomb, this force that creates whatever power the American empire has held over the world, this looming threat of absolute destruction, balanced indeed by La Conquistadora,
Mm. Mm.
who, as Sor Maria shows in her meditations on Mary, in being prepared for the Incarnation, is filled with the knowledge of all science, as we would call it, right? That the Sor Maria, I talk about this in the book. Sor Maria sees Mary, or Mary shows her the 9 days before the Annunciation. She was taken up into heaven and prepared to be the bride of Christ, so prepared to be the bride of God, and indeed therefore the bride of the Trinity. She's arrayed in gems and beautiful clothes, and made as if all gold, right? So she's become the Holy of Holies. But in order to prepare her for that role, I guess, she's also filled in her mind with all of the knowledge of creation. So it takes 9 days, and the first 6 days are the 6 days of creation. So of astronomy and botany and medicine, and the joke is, in one of the mid 20th century books about devotion to Mary, this is Hilda Graf, that if Mary, Mary's filled with all of this knowledge, well, surely she would also have been filled with, knowledge of nuclear physics. It's like, well, yes. Right? So there, yeah, these twinned and mirrored total visions of who we are and what reality we inhabit. One, the destructive explosion, and the other, the life-filled incarnation.
Mm. Well, this is the reason why I hammer Darwinism so much too, because the conversation that people are having at the moment is on the difficulty in defining ethnic identity in the West. That the West, the self-described Judeo-Christian West, has defined itself as. But it's an interesting thing, really, because in Mary, this thing is this terminology is clarified, and I think this is why I'm having such a big problem with the Darwinism thing as well, because the modern world is relying on Darwinism to make all of these categories where the Catholic world, the ancient apostolic world, it relies on Mary to define the church and relies on Mary to define the Christian experience. And Mariam herself is as we describe in the Theotokia, she's the pride of Judah. So when you're describing this this wedding of Mariam to the Holy Trinity, and her preparation as the bride, she's given all wisdom. She's given knowledge of all these sciences, right? So, as a Copt, I'm thinking, okay, so what you're actually describing is the gifting of total wisdom to a Judah woman, who is in two ways. She's of royal lineage, of Davidic descent, but also representing the creation of a new Israel, of a new civilization for us. And it resonates with the La Conquistadora and the bomb. You know, we have these two kind of potential ways to go, with the same desire, which is a desire for wisdom. You know, whereas Mary receives it as the Holy Mother of God. The West is defining itself Darwinistically instead of defining itself in this desire for wisdom that's realized in two different ways. I don't know if this is making sense.
Well, it's helping me because, of course, the thing we're not talking about is the choice that people make between her and the bomb.
Yes, to generate everything.
Right.
To generate God incarnate.
Right.
To generate civilization, to generate the church, to regenerate the Christians that pray to her, and then everything. Yeah. And then, of course, the people that have refused the Virgin and her Son, and who define themselves as deniers of her and her Son.
How do we help people see this? I mean, so I was actually, having some problems with this because I was talking to my mom, and you all know I grew up Presbyterian. My mom is Presbyterian. They do Bible study, and apparently her group spent the last year or the last session they were reading the letter to the Hebrews, which we should go through sometime really carefully, because it's other than Revelation, one of the most explicit descriptions of the way in which Christ is the high priest in the temple. And the sort of, if we're talking about Mary as the temple, the Marian imagery is stronger in Revelation, where the temple opens, the ark is seen, and the lady is clothed with the sun, right? Which is a pretty powerful atomic image. Saying atomic fires of a star, and she is in fact the lady clothed with the sun. She is the sun lady with the moon at her feet and the stars of her crown, battling the dragon, right? So there's and I trying to talk to my mom to figure out what it was they talked about. And it was tricky because I think Protestants typically are afraid to see this kind of power in the scriptures, particularly in Revelation with the images of heaven. So I said, so what are they reading now? Oh, they're going to read the Gospel of John. Oh yeah, really? How are you to deal with John, which seems to be the one that we get into most trouble with, because John makes he's also the author of Revelation, probably. Interesting that all of this biblical scholarship has gotten so, my mom was saying, oh, well, Paul didn't write Hebrews. And I'm like, how do you know that? The sort of scrambling of the scholarly criticisms of who wrote what and what's real and what's history and what's myth, and that large scale problem that you and I are wrestling with, of how to show the reality of the mythology that we live within. Oppenheimer wanted to, he was Hindu, right? Or why was he quoting the Bhagavad Gita at certain points, right? He grew up Jewish.
Yes.
So I think, maybe this is the direction to go, because we are, when I'm talking to my mom, saying, that there's a truth. There's truth in the scriptures, truth in the description of Jesus as the one who saves us from sin. The truth in Jesus is saying he's the way, the truth, and the life. The truth. Now, that means there's not like options, right? So you can say, which truth are you going to live by? The revelation of Christ, the materialist, Darwinian, eugenicist science, the rejection of Christ as a fraud and a liar and a deluded madman. Any other religious tradition. and we have been since, I don't know, at least 1893 in the World Parliament of Religions that was held in Chicago. Chicago's another place where they had a controlled nuclear reaction, right under what is now the library on my campus. This relative talk about theory of relativity, right, which is apparently what's behind the atomic bomb. I'm not sure. Apparently there's questions about that scientific stuff that Hans Schantz can explain for you all. Ethers knows better than I do. This horrible relativity of religious truth, right? Well, we can, my mom was starting to say, so we can agree to disagree. And I'm like, no, we can't. I'm not going to agree to disagree with you and say, that's all fine. I'm going to disagree and say, this is truth and this is wrong. And it's interesting that with Under the Bomb, there's the truth of, yes, we can split the atom and you'll all die, or not. I mean, is that not an absolute truth? I'm gibbering, I realize. And maybe that's where we are. We're in this sort of relativistic gibbering of inability to say Christ is the truth.
Yeah. No, there was a lot in there. It's good. Because well, the gibbering, the Western gibbering, is because of the technological capacity. Because in the face of the bomb, everything is relative. Because the bomb just proposes this power of a destructive force, which makes everything else around it seem irrelevant or relative, because it's a kind of assertion that the only thing that matters is power. I become death, the destroyer of worlds. Well, the only thing that matters there is death. I think this is why it's difficult, because the culture has been affected by that so much after the detonation of this bomb, and this imagination that everybody has been given with the film about Oppenheimer. It's making a claim that the only thing that really matters is who is able to become death. So is this making sense? Like this is an existential claim about the nature of human beings, as much as it was a scientific feat.
Yes.
It's we are become death, destroyer of worlds. What are you going to do against this? Because in the face of this kind of claim, everything is relative, right? Because how do you argue with death? How can you say there's another truth? In the face of the bomb, there is no truth. The bomb is the truth. That's the great American heresy. This is Oppenheimer's heresy. Is to say America has become death. So what we're doing then is either accepting that or we make a contrary claim and we say, okay, you became death, destroyer of worlds. Well, the the theory of relative. It's fascinating how the language works there.
Mm-hmm.
The theory of relativity allowed them, apparently, right, to create this bomb. A religious theory of relativity allowed them to create that bomb, because in their vision of the world, all there was is power, and the race to achieve this anti-godhood of death status. What did it do? It destroyed. So nobody can say anything, because everybody is too scared to say that the people that created this weapon and that themselves became death, you know, they've said it. Oppenheimer said it. I am become death. He's embodied death. They're scared to go up to death and say, no, you can't. You can't say there is no relativism unless you see that there is a weapon that's more powerful than that bomb. And this is why Christians can't argue with them. Because the Christian world doesn't think that it has any weapon that's more powerful than that bomb. It's forgotten its own history and its own origin, and it's forgotten Our Lady, who is our greatest weapon. And this is why nobody can argue anymore. You can't argue with death until you know that Christ is really the champion who destroys death. But because we don't have any faith or civilizational memory that the Christian world claimed to have a weapon that was stronger than death before, we're stuck in the scientific, we're stuck in the relative. I hope this makes sense.
I'm just sitting there thinking and saying, yes, this is it. This is this juxtaposition. I mean, I have literally lived with my entire life since I was a baby, and not been able to see why it's in this massive contradiction, which you say is this death cult of relativity versus the truth of the incarnation, that we are no longer confident, confides, with faith enough to say is the truth.
Yes. The more relative the cultures become, the closer to that bomb we all got. That's the crowning achievement of the modern world. And because everybody has seen it now, you know, they've seen the effect of it. It's like the big magic of America has worked on them to terrify them into thinking, okay, well, this is all that there is. I don't know if this is making sense.
We have now articulated the moment that we've been living in since 1945 so well, and then saying what I'm thinking about now is, like, what are the further implications of living in that moment. And one of the things that I thought that I was sort of thinking about to start with today is this statement that the New Zealand Prime Minister made. Chris Hipkins. Vox had put this on his blog, and we've all been looking at it and talking about it and thinking of it. Lots of discussion on Social Galactic. Everybody who's on Social Galactic and hasn't subscribed to Unauthorized TV, so you can get these videos and all the other videos, please subscribe. But Hipkins is saying that there were no compulsions in the mandates, right? In terms of the vaccine mandates, I acknowledge that it was a challenging time for people, but they ultimately made their own choices. There was no compulsory vaccination. Very fascinating there. People made their own choice. Now, of course, everybody's furious about that, because it did not feel like, oh, you know, there was no compulsion in all of those mandates. But as Vox has rightly pointed out, Hipkins is strictly speaking correct. People were not held down and jabbed. No. They were given a choice. Do you say no to this jab that then makes you this offer? If you get this jab, all of these other things will be available to you, right? It's like what he says. Vox said, This statement is sparking an amount of outrage, mostly among those who feel they were forced to get vaccinated. And while the outrage is understandable, the man is telling no more than the literal truth. Virtually no one was actually compelled to get vaccinated, as we were all presented with choices. To be threatened with the loss of one's job, the inability to play a sport, to drink in a club, or to eat in a restaurant, the cancellation of one's college acceptance or one's travel plans may be unpleasant, but it is still to be presented with a choice. Most people made bad choices. They made what in retrospect looked like very suboptimal and dangerous choices that prioritized their short-term preferences over their long-term health. So remember this next time. Remember this when the new mandates are put in place. The choice is still going to be yours. Learn from the mistakes that were made last time, and remember those who are putting you in this difficult position are going to point out after the fact that you were the one who made your choice. And that, I mean, to be, to acknowledge, Vox said that all along. And that was one of the things that I constantly kept meditating on in the midst of my university's mandates. And you and I talked about as well. It's like they can't force you. Yeah. And the choice is there. But it's like Jesus's temptation by Satan. So I'm going to, give you all of this if you do such and such. So I will give you, access. I mean, it was usually access, right? I will give you access to this restaurant or to this event or to this job, unfortunately, if you do this thing and you're wanting that job or the bomb is a giant jab as well, right? That there's this which of course the United States has been wielding against the rest of the world ever since 1945, disguised under, and this is, I mean, Oppenheimer, which I haven't seen, so I'm going on the hearsay, that the thing that the movie does try to present is the problem of, well, Oppenheimer was a communist. We knew that. He's part of the party. That the threat is, which I grew up under, right, as well. I mean, growing up in New Mexico with my family members working at the labs and so forth. And we're in the Cold War at that point, right? We're in the war with the not war with the Soviets over who's going to drop a bomb. That sort of, so when the jab stuff came along, when the vaccine mandates came along, it was like, this is a familiar situation where you are in fear of this thing that you can't actually do anything about, being given not choices about things that you wish you could or couldn't do. And that illusion, I mean, what's interesting about Oppenheimer making that quotation from, is it from the Bhagavad Gita that I become death, the destroyer of worlds? Yes. Okay, so whether it's from one of the Vedas or whether it's the Bhagavad Gita, that, I mean, one of the truths of that tradition is that all things are illusion, right? That we actually live in this Maya changeability, right? That we live in this not stable reality.
Yeah, it proposes everything is an illusion. It also proposes that it's an interesting point, actually. The incarnation versus the emanation of that tradition, that Indian or Bharati tradition.
Yes, we need to call it Bharat. How do we say it? Bharati?
Bharati, I don't know. It's still going to be India.
Good Greek tradition. Call it India.
India. It just sounds so cool. But the tradition proposes an emanation from Godhead. Everything that exists is just further away or closer away to this thing that they call Godhead, and therefore it's like anything can be God, even death can be God. So it's an interesting kind of thought that they've quoted this tradition because you couldn't get a more completely opposite thought than Christianity, than this kind of philosophy. we're claiming that there was one incarnation of God in flesh. This Eastern world proposes that there's many multiple reincarnations and everything is relative. It's really, really interesting. It's like that bomb gets dropped as an event, but it really just it explodes and it spreads an Eastern mystical fog over the West that didn't exist before.
Yep.
Where everyone's forgotten the incarnation, the moment of the Annunciation to Mary, of the incarnation, what the magnitude of Gabriel speaking to Mary meant. So it's like if the bomb is the moment of destruction of the West, philosophically, the moment of creation of the West, then is the Annunciation to Mary by Gabriel when he says, "Hail Mary." It's an opposing moment which has the same level of force on the worlds that the bomb had in the imagination.
The thing that I've been wrestling with, and I've obviously been wrestling with this in my scholarship all along and in my own devotions, is I'd say the absolute reality of Christ as truth. And the problem that Christians seem to be stuck in of simply saying that it's true and backing down against those categorized in the Gospel of John as those who deny it, which John calls Jews. And when I'm talking to my mom about this, she said, "Well, we can't hate," and I'm like, "I didn't say anything about hate. I said wrong. It's that Jesus is the Savior from what, right?" And sort of, I think, I feel like I want to project from this episode into all sorts of things that we're going to have to keep talking about at length over the next year. I don't know. How long does it take to actually convince people that Christ is the truth?
We'll be talking about it until everyone listens.
Oh, very good. So, guys, better grow our audience fast because you guys are in for a long ride. But it's I'm liking how we're breaking it down here, saying, why has it been so clouded? Why has it been so hard to simply say what the people who made that statue, La Conquistadora, made, the people who showed up in Santa Fe with it to convert the people who were already there, had that sense of, this is truth and we want to share it with you because it makes reality clearer to you, that you're lost in a fog without it. And that there, I'd say, and there can't be multiple options in this story. And that is where, that's with the relativity, that's where people, I think, get hung up. It's like, well, why can't I just understand God the way I wish I like it? Why? And this will say, well, just the Judaism. Why can't the sense that the not Jesus rabbis have the prerogative to make decisions for their congregations as they see fit be okay?
Short answer? No, the long answer.
we gotta figure out some way to get. We're piecing our way through this atomic fog right now. I'm gonna have to change the cover that I prepped for tonight's episode if we don't get to Theophilus.
You know how much I love Rabbi Walks.
Oh my gosh, she did it. Oh, I'm gonna have to completely change the cover, and it's be. I'm gonna make a mushroom cloud versus Our Lady for the cover for this one. Yeah.
Yes. Well, for anyone who doesn't know what that term is, I've been using it for a little
Please
while to
explain
describe
Rabbi
what
Wars
is
so that okay, we're
Rabbi
in Rabbi
Wars.
Wars, and this is
Yeah.
the fundamental problem of relativity in the claims that
Yes.
Judeo-Christian as a term is obscuring, and people thinking that they can hold those two things together in one reality and not have their brains explode. Boom. Like an atomic bomb. You know, splitting the atom of reality.
Splitting the atom of reality. That's what we've been doing. So so to define a rabbi wars, how would I define a rabbi war? Basically, the history of Israel is a history of rabbi wars. The intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, Israel was without a prophet for hundreds of years. And in this time, the synagogue system emerged. I can't give you the dates because I'm very bad at dates, but Hellenized Hebrews, Hellenized Israelites became a bit of a problem. We tend to travel around and go into different nations and whatever. Like me, they're a fan of Greek culture. But by the time the New Testament is written, you know, the beginning of the stories in the New Testament, this intertestamental period has left the Judeans in Judea, this remnant of Israel that's there in the southern kingdom of Israel that's there in Judea. It's left them in this kind of hopeless, ghettoized situation within the Roman Empire. They have an enormous problem in that they've been reduced to being colonial subjects of Rome, but also inside the Judean presence, there is sectarian. There's massive sectarian combat because the hundreds of years without a prophet has resulted in them constantly arguing over interpretations of the law, interpretations of the temple tradition also. And so they get this synagogue system which develops where depending on what sect you're in, you have a varying interpretation of the law. This is where Sadducees and Pharisees come from. This is where the Zealots emerge, you know, the Zealots being the kind of suit up and boot up legalistic nationalists, you know, this kind of stuff. So it's in this environment that Christ emerges. It's in this environment that John the Baptist is born and starts his mission to hail the Messiah, because the Israelites that are in Judea are scattered. The sheep are scattered everywhere. We don't have a central point of interpretation for the law. It's rabbi versus rabbi. So this is where I say it's rabbi wars, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they hate each other. People are laughing at the Zealots. You know, there's like a million people come up and claim to be the Messiah every 15 minutes.
Life of Brian springs to mind as
exactly. Exactly. And so John the Baptist comes and says the Messiah is coming, and of course, well, people they believe him to be baptized, but then the majority of the population are rolling their eyes, thinking, "Oh no, not another one!" You know. So Christ is incarnated to the Judeans, who at that time are entrenched in rabbi wars. And what I find really funny about this is that Christians are scared. They're scared to even say that word,
rabbi. Although Mary Magdalene says that to Christ when he appears in the garden, Rabboni.
Yes, she does. She calls him Rabboni, as does Nicodemus, who's a Pharisee. He calls him Rabbi, Rabboni. You're a master of the law. Christ is the rabbi for us, the chief rabbi of Israel. But he's born into this environment where he has to go out and he has to do rabbi wars. So he goes through the synagogue system. He's you know, he reads from the law in the synagogue. And even after the crucifixion and the resurrection, the early church are still engaged in rabbi wars within the synagogues. So it's very strange that the Christian world is so scared to uh, to 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 look at this period, because the moment you say anything like this, of course, people are, even now, they're going to hear me and they're going to think I'm talking in a racial way, but I'm not. I'm speaking in a sectarian way or in an interpretive way, in the way where Israelites were engaged in these rabbi war debates within the synagogue system, the synagogues all over the Mediterranean. And it took some time for the apostles to go, you know what, we're going to abandon the synagogues and we're not going to debate in here anymore because people aren't listening to us. For the early church, the point of contest was within the synagogue itself. The church emerges out of rabbi wars. Yeah. So I lost my train of thought there. We link it to oh yes, what your mother was saying about hate,
right? And the hate there, the hate, and so I'm my poor mother being brought into this, but it's like she's the example of the Bible study that devout Protestants are engaged in, and particularly Presbyterians, which is where I came from, right? It's like my other roots is the Presbyterian ministers in my mom's family, who were out there in the West because they're the first preacher man in the region. The other thing I gave her, I sent her, was a book that I picked up from the I can't remember whether I mentioned this on stream, but the Scott Hahn and John Bergsma from the St. Paul Center came and gave some talks at Cantius a few weeks ago, and I found from Bergsma, he did a book on the Jewish roots of Christianity, specifically talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's actually a very nice little book. He himself is an Old Testament scholar, so he knows all the languages. Yes, he can read them all because he grew up Presbyterian too. We all grew up Presbyterian, and we're all worrying about Scripture study. So there you go. And the group that you see in the Dead Sea Scrolls is yet another of these. It's the Essenes. And Bergsman does a very nice job in this little book on the Dead Sea Scrolls, showing the way in which John, in particular, draws on language that is very, very similar to things that you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and their attention to images of light and the baptism. That John the Baptist is probably also from the same milieu, although it seems like he probably didn't live with them because they have these celibate, stable communities, and John's wandering around in the desert and stuff. But it's much of the language that shows up in the New Testament makes contextual sense if you recognize it's in these Dead Sea Scrolls, which should absolutely everybody trump all of these rabbi wars in terms of priority, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are acknowledged as the oldest copies that we have of anything. Like if you're talking about physical proof, right? That we're always arguing. We've talked about this in our Scrolls and Trolls episode of last autumn, right? We're saying if you're trying to understand where the scriptures come from, it's a process of transmission and copying, and which are the oldest manuscripts. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls trump all of that because they are actually, copies of the scriptures made at the time of Jesus's life, and include examples from particularly Isaiah, but also Jubilees, which I think we've talked about. I'm not sure. Unfortunately, guys, I'm going to end up starting talking footnotes again, because it's the only way to keep from being completely relative and whatever you think. No, it's not all relative. There are trackable traditions in these debates, and one of them is that, in fact, what Jesus says and what John says Jesus says comes out on the basis of these scrolls as being, in fact, the ancient tradition. This is a problem, I think, for Christians now, because they often feel like apologetic because of the way they've been taught to talk about the relationship between the New Testament and the Old Testament. Oh, well, there was the Old Testament, and it had one religious system, and then the New Testament came along, and it's as if the New Testament came along and just invented its own religion, appropriating the Old Testament.
Yeah, it seems to be completely divorced in the way that people describe it.
Right.
This kind of mildly referential version that emerges in the New Testament, which I suppose is why a lot of people say they don't like reading the Old Testament, right? They get scared. It's like, no, we don't like the Old Testament God. We like the New Testament God,
which is a
same God.
heresy. Marcion, right? One of the earliest heresies was denying that that God is revealed in both the older scriptures and the newer scriptures. Now we're going to get to covenant. We said covenant is like contract, which is I think we're just going to have to do this slowly and unpack things. Then we can refer people back to our previous episodes and say, see, we've been taking this down. But the principal problem most Christians have now, and this is very specifically a problem for Protestants, and it's interesting. It's a problem for Catholics, but in a kind of indirect and lazy way. That they feel like they have to apologize for reading the Old Testament because that really belongs to the Jews. I that's why we end up with this Judeo-Christian nomenclature, because it's saying, well, but the tradition from the Old Testament and the tradition from the New Testament, they blend, right? It's like, well, no, not exactly.
No. There's a few things in there. First, which Jews? Not all Hebrews or not all Israelites rejected Christ.
Right.
Not
all the ones that wrote the New Testament,
diaspora,
for example, except recognized Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. The tradition of interpretation of the Old Testament that is Israelite or Hebrew is not, how shall I say, there isn't only one of those, which is Judaic. The Old Testament interpretation of Hebrew people fell into two different sects very early on, which was the Christian and the then Pharisaical,
right?
The ones that were not
who Jesus quite clearly in the Gospels disagrees with.
Quite strongly. And then poor Nicodemus, who is a Pharisee, right. He has to hide because he doesn't have the ability to openly say, I think that this is the Messiah. I think this man is the fulfillment of our scriptures, because of rabbi wars. Because in this institution in Judea, the Pharisees had amounted so much political power and cultural power that they were beyond questioning in terms of being the authority of the Old Testament, the authorities of the law. They'd claimed a monopoly of Old Testament interpretation, which Christ challenged directly many times, and only Nicodemus was able to come out and say, secretly, but he did come out of the Pharisaical sect and talk with Christ and ask him for his rabbinic interpretation. So I think this is why it's so sticky for everybody, because they're not looking at how this claim of being the one who interprets the Old Testament defines the entire story of the gospel, really, in the sense of Christ being the one who arrives and claims that he is the sole authority of interpretation of the law, as fulfillment of the law. And it's not something that's discussed in Christianity now, in modern Christianity. People, of course, they'll talk about Christmas and Easter. They do the festivals, they do everything. They say, Jesus was the Messiah. Okay, moving forward. But in order to have a look at that relationship, I think it's very important to have a look at that relationship between Nicodemus and Christ, because you see the first glimpse of what it means for the Christians at the time, who were Hebrews, to say, we are claiming that our rabbi has supreme authority over all others. It's a very bold claim. That's what they were doing, though. And so if you acknowledge this, well, you can't get rid of the Old Testament, because Christ himself is claiming to be the one who can interpret it for us and reveal the scriptures in himself with an accurate interpretation.
Well, and what you just said, that so one of the things that Scott Hahn pointed to was the conversation on the way to Emmaus that Jesus has with the two disciples, who's showing them that he is in the scriptures. But this is okay. So maybe we're just this is all a prologue to the thing that we were going to talk about. We thought we were going to talk about with Mary, but in Mary and the Art of Prayer, try to make the strong point that neither Jesus nor Mary mean anything unless they're fulfilling those scriptures, right? It's like it's not like they just showed up. And, this is the problem, saying, oh, Jesus showed up and worked miracles and therefore everybody believed he was the Son of God. It's like, no, because that claim means nothing unless it's in the context, the frame of the story, which says God has revealed himself through the prophets and through the laws, and here he is fulfilling them. Jesus is nonsensical unless he is actually the fulfillment of the prophecies from the Old Testament. And likewise, my bigger, the stronger claim I make in Mary Art of Prayer, Mary is likewise seen as fulfilling images and prophecies and figures from the Old Testament. And again, otherwise, what she's some illiterate peasant woman who gets, raped by a Roman soldier, probably named Panthera, who then claims that her son is, delusions of, again, it's like either Jesus is nuts and delusional and a sadist, masochistic sadist, as some have claimed, or that you see him within the fulfillment frame of the prophecies, including very powerfully in Isaiah, many of which copies of the scriptures, of those scriptures, they have it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's interesting to me that Christians seem so unwilling to acknowledge this, robustly as the basis for our faith. You don't get to say, oh, well, Jesus could have been right, but these other rabbis are also right, and therefore everybody gets to be right.
No. They're scared because they don't understand the rabbinical, the rabbi wars. They don't understand the rabbinical contests that were going on in the synagogue system at the time. The sectarian split between Sadducee, Pharisee, Zealot, Essene, the multiple claims of messianic arrival that were happening. I mean, it was not just one person that arrived and said, I am the Christ, and even our Lord said, many will come say that I'm the Christ. There's always someone arriving claiming to be the Messiah. There can only be one. It's the same thing with the rabbi wars. When Christ is talking to Nicodemus, when the early church are speaking within the synagogue system itself, they're going through this process of arguing with the rabbinical authorities to say, we have found the supreme authority. And this is why they get into trouble. This is why they get kicked out of the synagogues, because they're essentially saying, you cannot possibly interpret better than the Lord himself, who has incarnated in the Virgin. There is not a single rabbi who can make a claim now that he is able to interpret the law better than Jesus Christ. This is a very uncomfortable thing to state. This is why people are not able to argue about religion anymore, because they don't actually see Christ as an Israelite interpreting the law within synagogue system as Rabboni. However, it is obvious that in the beginning of his ministry and even after his resurrection, that his own people were calling him rabbi. Mary Magdalene said, Rabboni. Why would she say that unless she was serious? He is our rabbi. So maybe it's a thing that people come into Christianity from different points, different traditions, different cultures, but the I mean, the remembrance of the early church, and what the apostles were doing and the disciples were doing, they are Israelites, they're Judeans. These are people that are still connected with the temple tradition and very much concerned with the correct interpretation of the law.
Right.
And it was the arguing and squabbling over the correct interpretation of the law that oppressed everybody so much, because the hyper legalism of the Pharisees had made everybody unable to access God. This is why Christ was so angry with them. He was angry with them because they had heaped on so many burdens on everybody through this legalistic thinking that they could no longer see God in the Old Testament. It was just a book of rules. And it's a temptation that so many people have now. How are we going to fix everything? What rules do we need? You talk about this all the time, you know, everyone sort of, their fallback is, which rules do we need?
Let's talk about this more, because this is actually the crux, right? Another of the things that I saw, crux, get it? Across the Midwest and the billboards out there, alongside the ones for Uranus fudge, were billboards for and I've forgotten the phone number for it. 83 The Truth. There you go. You can call him. Jesus can save you from sin.
Mm-hmm.
That was actually really well said. It's like, that's what Jesus saves us from, is sin. What sin?
What is sin? Well, we talked about it in a previous stream.
Yeah, but we keep talking about it because we haven't, we haven't convinced everybody that yes, you must be Christian in order to be saved. What does it mean to be saved from sin? And this, sort of the context of the Rabbi Wars is, of course, hinges on a definition of sin. What is sin?
Well, when we talked about it last time, we showed the example of that Balenciaga fashion show that now bizarrely repeated in the Burning Man Festival.
The Burning Man Festival, it's like everything's coming back for us, right? It's like everything that we talked about last year is now being revealed in its fullness, and Burning Man buried in mud, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm. All the stuff that you want to put on that Burning Man and have burned away, but you can't because you're literally mired in mud. You're stuck in the mud. That's sin. Can't wash it off. Can't get out of it.
But why would you want to wash it off? I mean, this is, I think, so most of the time, this is the sort of the blunter version. It's like, so we've got a lot of images floating around here right now. And since I didn't quite plan this properly with the images, I don't have any images to show you guys. So you just have to listen and keep it all in your heads. The bomb, the destruction of matter, and the bringing of death by way of that weapon. The claim of utter relativity that accompanies that theory of relativity that theoretically brings us that bomb, meaning there is no truth. Everyone has your truth, his truth, her truth. There is no actual truth. The pernicious and devastating social problem that we have now with when Christians say Jesus can save you from sin, people tell us we're being hateful. Particularly that we're being hateful towards those who how to say this so that people hear properly. Whatever Jews are, they disagree with Christians on this one central claim that Jesus saves from sin. Is that fair?
Yeah.
I mean, there are Jews for Jesus, right? But that, in my head, doesn't that make them Christian? You recognize Jesus as the Christ, you are Christian. And if you don't recognize Jesus as the Christ, And then the sort of the anti-binary is complicated, because as it makes the whole world Jewish if they don't recognize Jesus as Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Or does it? No, because they're not necessarily living under other rabbinic decisions.
Well, I mean, in terms of Western culture, the influence. How should I put this? I think because Western culture, what people call Judeo-Christian, emerges from rabbi wars. So in that way, the term Judeo-Christian is appropriate, but not for the reason why people are using it.
I've been thinking about that. It is Judeo-Christian, but it's the competition. I mean, fundamentally between a legalistic, the medieval version of it was the legalistic and the sacramental. I think. Right, recognizing baptism as salvific versus recognizing the law as necessary in the. Well, okay, I have read bits of the Talmud, and that's not quite the way it looks in the Talmud, so we didn't go there.
Yeah, we'll later.
Well, no, the thing is, one of the things I was thinking about, this is, everybody, obviously, the elephant in the room is what the ADL is talking about with X and Musk and stuff like that. We're trying to figure out a way to get through to the actual substance of this debate, which unfortunately is creating an atomic bomb in our culture of actual, destructions of everything, right? We're not able to speak out loud the longing that we have, that as Christians, the longing that we have for everyone to be gathered in God's love.
Well, it's become worse now, because laid on top of the theological context is Darwinism.
Right.
People are not speaking about this theologically. They're speaking about it Darwinistically in many cases, which is why it trips them up even further.
Right.
Because probably anyone watching this video later on is going to see it and interpret it in a Darwinist lens. They can't help it. They've been programmed. Everybody's been programmed by Darwinism to see things in a genetic or a racial context instead of to see things in terms of the rabbinical, which includes Christ as our rabbi.
Right.
So the problem is then, I think, not that the whole world is Jewish, it's that the whole world has been created by Western civilization or influenced by Western civilization without understanding Western civilization and what it is. Western civilization emerges out of the collapse of the pagan order of Europe and the East, and the emergence of the church in this environment. And what is the church? The church is the ecclesia in Greek, those called out. And what are we called out of? We're called out of the synagogue system. We're called out of that rabbinical rabbi wars. Why? Because we no longer have to have rabbi wars. We have found our rabbi. We have found our interpreter of the law. We found the fulfillment of the old law. We found the perfection of the temple religion in Christ through his mother. I think that's probably a clearer way of describing it, is that we've invited everybody to come into Western civilization. It's the new world, the new West, the post-Christian West. It's modernity. It's this vending machine culture that doesn't see itself with any religious foundation. It's the West as we know it is in that relativistic, the West is in relativism. That's not how it always was. So I think if you give Westerners any kind of pressure, as I've done the last couple of months with some conversations with some people here in Australia, because Australia is very allergic to any kind of religious debate, dialogue, let alone a debate. Like this conversation would be enough to have people chasing me down the street with a pitchfork.
We're being so,
Well, that's because
we're being
they don't.
so mild. Yes.
I know, but that's how fragile it
Yes.
is, because relativism is fragile. It's like the bomb. You can't touch it too much or it'll explode. Poof! And that's how people are now. They're atomic. Everything is preset for destruction, because they are in relativism mode, and no one can make a truth claim. No one can say, no, we have one rabbi, we have the interpretation of the law, etc. They're so far removed from the origin of Western civilization inside rabbi wars, you know, that the milieu of the church and what the church became, and so removed from Israelite history and Israelite identity in that way, that they don't even have the language to explain these things. So they're just stuck in a sense, because like the rooster.
Your rooster agrees.
No, it's interesting. Well, it's like Peter, you know, denying Christ 3 times, and then the rooster crows. Do it again. He's going to do it again. The West has denied Christ. Yeah, there you go. Now he's back. The West has denied Christ, but once the West denies Christ, it's denying the rabbinical foundation of Western culture, of Catholic civilization, without replacing it with anything else. I don't know if this is making any sense whatsoever, but
your rooster thinks
the rooster
so.
seems to agree.
So no, but so this is. I mean, to be fair to myself, I've been trying to explain this for my whole career, and and also to be fair to myself, nobody in my academic context can do it either, right? Because I think that like the study of religions begins in the modern scholarly context in 1893 in Chicago with the World Parliament of Religions, where there's just sort of this agreement that we're not going to choose between stories. But as you pointed out, we're not actually allowed to choose between stories. We must believe certain stories. You can know which ones you must believe, because they're the ones that will get you fired if you disagree with them. You made your choice, right? And so I'm sort of thinking of this now. Is I do want to project a program of what we're going to try to achieve over the next several episodes, months, this year. I mean, it's just like how do we get to the point of, I mean, you and I share it already, but how do we get to the point of expressing the singularity of the truth that we see in our Lord? And one thing I'm thinking as you're talking is, okay, so understanding Christianity as, you know, a rising out of these rabbi wars. It also, but also, and this is like our atomic bomb metaphor is interesting, because America has gone out into the world, and I think Coca-Cola is the other image there, right? Infected it with our syrup, our Coke spirit. One of the other books I read over the holiday was this History of the World in 6 Glasses, and you know, there's beer, wine, distilled spirits, coffee, tea, and Coke. It's interesting, of course, that Coke is the one that's branded. It's considered very American. It explodes out of the United States in the same way that the atomic bomb did, so that the whole world has bottling, you know, facilities, as you can find out in the Coca-Cola experience in Atlanta. The entire world's covered with sticky syrup because of Coke.
Yes.
And our vending machine culture is participating in that and saying that vision of reality, the American imperial reality, which is sweetened with Coke and threatened with this bomb, nobody is allowed to disagree with that, except for BRICS, who are now pulling out of the dollar. and say, and there, of course, come with that vision of American reality certain truth claims that also we are not allowed to contest without losing our jobs. So we don't in fact inhabit a relative world. We inhabit an absolute world that is at odds with Christ, which he always said his kingdom was not of this world. So there's that side. But then I was also thinking, as you were talking, saying that Rabbi War's version of reality has a different sort of character when, as for example, in the Land of Enchantment, you recognize the Christian coming up against traditions of mythology and ritual and community that didn't come out of the rabbinic discussions at all. The Pueblo, for example.
Yes.
And that overlay of imperialism, the Christian expansion by way of, for example, the Spanish. It's like we've talked about this many times, saying the English-speaking world is very uncomfortable with that Catholic expansion because the English-speaking world doesn't like the Pope, because the English-speaking world doesn't like the Spanish, because the English-speaking world spent most of its time trying to steal from the Spanish. And believing mythologies about the Spanish that therefore justified the English-speaking world in doing whatever it could to defeat it and destroy it. For example, the Inquisition, which then gives the that thread throughout all of this of the place of those rabbinic the participants in rabbinic traditions that don't accept Christ.
Well, I mean, that's Judaism. Right. That's the emergence of the counter rabbinic tradition that is contemporaneous with the emergence of the church.
Right.
They both come out at around the same. Well, actually, no. The church emerges first, and afterwards, Jerusalem is destroyed, and then the synagogue system that is survives the destruction of Jerusalem begins to create what is now known as Judaism. That's the rabbinical interpretation that is developed after the church makes its claim as the one true rabbinical interpretation.
Right.
So what we have then is, on top of all of these competing imperial powers,
it was such only 6 drinks. I'm not really sure. It's like, maybe if we could. Yes. Okay. Carry on.
So I mean, like, it's intense, though. Really, like, this is the history that we've lived in as Westerners for so long. In all of these imperial powers emerging and then collapsing and emerging, collapsing, borders getting gobbled up, and nations coming out, and then whatever, you've got this rabbinical system which is running parallel to the church, and it's quite intense because I mean, as I'm joking about all the time, your accent changes, your nationality changes a lot. The rabbinical system runs throughout all of the world the same way that the Catholic faith does. It's like the church and the synagogue kind of hitchhiking on empires. It's kind of cool if you think about it like that. But the difficulty in, I think, explaining this to everybody now is that because they're thinking in a Darwinistic mindset, they don't realize exactly I'd say what I consider to be the most beautiful aspect of Christendom is that it is this glorious revelation of the promise of Israel in a really unexpected way. The church just goes all over the Mediterranean, and suddenly what Israelites were waiting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years for is suddenly a reality in this horrible collapsed Roman Empire environment. It's very, very beautiful. we've had to survive all of these imperial emergences and collapses in the same way that the competing rabbinical system has done. This, the Judaism itself is running through all of these different empires also. It just doesn't help anybody to interpret this in a Darwinistic way at all. And when Europeans did start interpreting this Darwinistically, it went really, really bad. So this is where the fear comes from. It's like, we can't have these conversations because next we're going to start talking about blood purity, and then we're going to talk about racial fractions. We can't have this conversation because we had this conversation before, guys. 80 years ago, we had this conversation and a lot of people died. So let's never have this conversation again. The problem is, you are Darwinists.
Right.
You do not think in terms of the tradition of the rabbis. You think in racial fractions. And until, I think, like for me, until Westerners can give up the Darwinism, they can't handle this topic. And it's like on X, Twitter, X, whatever, this week, everyone's saying ban the ADL, ban this, ban that, whatever. I don't know how many people that are engaged in the call for banning the ADL are still thinking Darwinistically, but now would be the time to stop. I think now would be the time for everybody to realize that the only reason why these calls for defamation are happening and everyone's getting their reputation destroyed is because the West has been so allergic to rabbi wars and so addicted to Darwinism that it can't handle its own tradition. It can't handle its own ancient origins. It can't handle looking at what the church really is. Yeah, that's my take on what's happening right now. Banning an organization is not going to fix this if you don't actually understand what Christianity is and what the apostles were preaching and who they were preaching.
Well, and this is took us almost the whole time just to get to this point, which is what I thought was our starting point. That the only reason the ADL works is because people are afraid in the first place. It's all fear. Yeah. It's like with the mandates with the vaccination, right? They make you afraid of the virus, and therefore afraid. And it runs. I mean, it's like the atomic bomb, death, destroyer of worlds, fear. And at the root of all of it, as I see it, is this fear of acknowledging Christ. Always.
Yeah.
It's always. So all of these fears run on the fear of acknowledging our salvation.
Just like Nicodemus was afraid.
Right.
Yeah. He went in secret to the Lord because he was afraid. That's interesting.
But that is, to recognize that it's the, people instead of, I'd say with the vaccination things, we started the prayer group on campus last year. We're going to do it again this year because people are still afraid. You still need to keep praying that Satan works primarily on fear. Fear. So we've talked about with Sauron. We talked about with, all of these things. The ADL works on your fear of being called names. And all of these companies will collapse for fear of being called names. For we're not able to talk actually about proper, understand proper historical processes or even events, because you might be called a name for disagreeing with the previous historiography. Like racist, right? Something like that. I mean, so it's interesting that, there's on these various layers, there's, from my perspective, always this problem of narrative, both in small n and large n, which I also can call mythology, of the way in which you've been taught the story in the past And this I also encounter with my family, my mom, for example, when I'm trying to explain things to her, and she's saying, well, that's not what I was taught in school. And I've learned to hear that and understand. It's like there's a terrible fear of having your story destabilized. And that fear of having your story destabilized is worse than finding out, for example, you know what? Spanish Inquisition didn't kill that many people. Right? No, I mean, it didn't. We know from the records, because the other thing the Spanish Inquisition did was keep really good records, right? And there's studies now in the modern scholarship of showing those terror myths that, for example, the English spread about the Spanish, their imperial, opponents, about how terrifying the Spanish Inquisition was, and if you Protestants get caught up in it, everybody's going to be burned at the stake. We had a little bit of this happening. I think it was in your chat recently on Telegram. It's like, oh, you Catholics won't acknowledge that 50 million people were killed by the Catholic Church, and we're like, which ones are you talking about? What it's exactly who are you counting? And because usually that sort of fear fog is like the atomic bomb, right? It just fills the air, and you don't get any chance to actually count anything because it's all relative. That the Inquisition kept very careful records of how the trials went, and most people brought before the Inquisition walked away. In fact, people preferred to be tried by the Inquisitional courts in Spain than secular courts, because the Inquisition actually knew how to do a proper investigation. Thus its name, Inquisition. So even to be able to challenge that I can talk to people. It's interesting, maybe more my mom's generation than my students when I did the course on alt history last winter, but you can tell people something that actually means things were better than they thought, and they don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that, in fact, not as many people died as they thought. They prefer to have the horror story, because the worst horror is finding out their story was wrong.
Yes. Now imagine if you've had the same story for 2,000 years. And this is where it gets really difficult, because conversation now is always placed on a Darwinistic frame instead of on narrative frame, and on
so I think
the mythological.
Unpack what you mean by Darwinistic.
Darwinism, in the sense that people are interpreting the human experience through biological race, what Darwin referred to as the origin of the favored races in his Origin of Species, and the system that comes out of that, in that it transforms human relationships and the understanding of ethnicity into a Darwinistic interpretation that puts people that look similar into the same category. And then says they're the same race because they look similar, which isn't how it works genetically, because Darwin didn't understand genetics. They hadn't actually discovered the DNA sequence yet. So Darwin based all of his things on what he could see visually. But the virus of his thinking carries through in the interpretation of human ethnicity and race, which is what happened in Germany, in post-Protestant Germany specifically, leading to the entire shit show of what happened there, with people applying for papers to prove that they were Aryan enough to be German, and that they didn't have, X percentage of Jewish heritage that would interfere with their blood purity. So for me, when I talk about Darwinism, I'm talking about the thinking that results in people speaking of humans in terms of racial fractions, and not in ancient ethnicity, and in terms of blood purity as a result of racial fractions. And
I think there's another layer in the Darwinian version of things. Is like they're also survival of the fittest, and that certain races are more fit, which is the Aryan claim in the Nazi ideology.
Yes. And that was the claim. That's why I've been like since you ran away, and I've been banging out all my sandwiches about the Irish as well. Because the Irish question ruins this, the Irish relationship to America ruins this, that a lot of people are not willing to look at. So, of course, I was talking about that because if you put people together that you think look similar and therefore they become the same race, but you reference history, it was not always so. The Irish in America were not considered to be the same ethnicity as the Anglos. According to Darwin, the Irish were below the Negro. He put them on the scale of racial hierarchy in terms of survival of the fittest. The Irish are right at the bottom. And interestingly, I think that Catholics don't traditionally think like this. Darwinism doesn't come out of Catholicism. Darwinism comes out of the Anglo mind, right? So it's not the Spanish thought.
Right.
Well, the KKK in America were very anti-Catholic. So I think it's a very interesting thing that wherever you see this Darwinistic thinking, you're seeing something which is very anti-Catholic.
Fundamentally, yes.
It is. Yeah, it is. I forget how I got there because I was ranting.
Well, I was asking you. You've talked about the Darwinism, and I'm asking you to define it more. I mean, and we're realizing. I wish I had a blackboard and we could have charted all this out, because then maybe people keep it in all people's minds and realizing this is the way the Mosaic Ark thinks all the time, which is in these, what you're trying to find the networks and associations and patterns between different levels of analysis constantly, and seeing the way they cancel each other out or compromise them, and also therefore in compassionately understanding why people freak out when we talk about stuff, so that we can say what is it that's triggering that response for you so that you can't hear us. And so you've been working hard on the Darwinian problem of these racial fractions. And well, I had, because even it's happening. It happens to me. It happens to, and I think it happens to me. You're in a different context, because in my neighborhood, it's like black and white are a little more clearly differentiated because there's lots of Black Americans. Although the sub fractions of the not Black Americans that are in this neighborhood are more complicated than that, and then the Black Americans are distinguished regionally by their different accents of the places they came from before they were in Chicago and when their families came to Chicago. So it's complicated too. There's a lot of Nigerians in the neighborhood as well. So that's a different set.
To add some more complexity.
But of course, if you're in the Catholic Church, none of that matters because you're in Christ.
Yes.
As in, Santa Fe. It's the Holy Faith of St. Francis of Assisi, which is why I always thought Santa Fe was in St. Faith, but it's not. It's the Holy Faith of St. Francis of Assisi in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a church, cathedral church presided over by the great French bishop, Archbishop, who was sent there in the 19th century to organize everything. So that's Catholicism of the nations in Christ.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the fear of defamation, the fear of being accused of committing a defamation, this really comes out of this Darwinistic mentality, I believe. Because instead of being able to state a truth claim and to be able to say very clearly where the Christian faith emerges, what the church was as a Hebrew institution or an Israelite institution at its origins, that the Virgin Mother of Christ herself in our tradition is hailed as the pride of Judah, that there is, I'm kind of going on this tangent to trying to explain to people in the West how odd it is in a Coptic mindset for someone to say to me ever, or to any Coptic people, you are anti-Semitic.
Right.
Like this phrasing that people are using now. Because for us, our entire identity as Copts centers on devotion to the Virgin, which is devotion to the Pride of Judah. Wherever we see Our Lady, we see Israel. Wherever she is, wherever Theotokos is, we see Israel. There is no it's a very not Protestant way to see the gospel.
Right.
You know, the Protestants have seen the gospel that we're Virgin Mary got pregnant, yes, and then Jesus came after that. Mary's gone. For us, it's not like this. The Virgin is, for us, the definition of all of Israel's hopes and expectations. In her, all of the promises are realized because it's through her that the Lord is incarnated. And I think because people in the West are not really thinking in this way, that when we see the Virgin, we are seeing Israel because she is the Pride of Judah. They're stuck in this mindset of thinking, okay, well, we're going to have these discussions. We have to be scared. Because why? Because deep down, there's a damage in their way of thinking, and that they revert to fractions. Always they're reverting to racial fractions. They're reverting to a Darwinistic interpretation of the nations instead of seeing it in the ancient way, which is apostolic, that Israel itself is redeemed in Christ, and then the apostles go out amongst the nations to pull them into Israel and to bring them into the church. I don't know if I'm rambling too much.
I just listening.
Hopefully, I'm trying to explain.
Stop apologizing.
This,
You're good. Although you're apologizing in the right way, which is the apologia, which is the explanation. That I mean, we're gonna have to just face on the Catholic versus Protestant. Unfortunately, I think.
Yeah.
Because the fear is the Protestant fear is the tradition got it wrong. Fundamentally.
Yep.
And the reason that the Protestants end up tangled up in the way that they do from the 16th century in the scriptural studies is, one, they start reading the Hebrew version that exists by that point, which denies Christ. And two, because they reject the frame, the tradition, the narrative of interpretation that came from the ancient church, they aren't sure anymore. I mean, it's like famously Protestantism ends up in multiple rabbi wars of its own, right? It's like every single preacher man is his own rabbi, effectively. And that, I mean, the true apology, I was actually frustrated a little bit with Hahn and Bergsma. And it's like, I understand where they're coming from because they grew up Presbyterian, as I did. They both had, deep training in it before they converted to the church. And their version of proof is to show you the way in which Jesus fulfills the scriptures. I'm like, well, that's fine. I'm fine with that. But they're talking to Catholics who, interestingly, in this context, were happy to hear them making all these arguments about scripture because Catholics aren't reading the scriptures enough. I mean, they're absorbed in the liturgy and absorbed in the tradition, but they don't actually read the scriptures enough. So it's like you end up with this two sides of the story. One, the sort of textual proof of the reality of the tradition on which the text itself depends, which we've talked about a lot, but I think bears continuing to unpack, which is then participating in the fears of historical defense that the empires create for themselves. And it's very interesting that what happened in 1945 was the United States drops those bombs and creates for itself a new mythology, which is death to question.
Mm.
And therefore people, just like with the masks and the vaccines, became very, it's nearly impossible for people to ask questions about it without coming up against that horror of reality not being what they thought it was.
Mm. Mm.
Which is why the ADL can play the games that it does with people's fear.
Mm. Mm. I mean, it's a kind of really, it's an imposition of interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is something that people are going to have to start to think about. And anyone that is involved in this like online campaign to ban the ADL, you really have to think about what this means. It's what are you trying to ban, really? It's the think about it. What are you trying to ban?
It's your choice.
Yeah, it's exactly it. For me, it's the imposition of an interpretation of the law. It's an imposition of interpretation of terms which belong to the church. And this is where the Protestants are going to get a really, really difficult time because, I mean, we never divorced these terms. We have not had a Protestant experience in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
This is the ancient apostolic church, and they, unfortunately, I shouldn't say this now. Thank you to the Western powers, Protestantism is being poured into the Nile region.
Right. Along with the Coca-Cola.
Along with the Coca-Cola, the one and the same. That vending machine needs one to get the other. But in terms of the Copts, all along the Nile, we're anchored in the same place that the Church Fathers were in terms of our interpretation and our use of these, the terms that we use. So it's something that I wrote about on Gab. I was so mystified by everybody's reaction to what Ye was saying last year. And then I said, okay, this is interesting because it shows what's going on there, that in America, what you have is a war over authority to interpret the story.
Yes.
That's what this really is. And because particular religious traditions in America are so caught up and infused in the machinery of the empire there, Americans find it very difficult to tell one from another sometimes. There was an article that was posted, Torba posted an article about how, people are leaving the churches, but they're still retaining their faith, and they're sort of treating the arena of politics like it was their church. So I thought that was interesting, because now you're bringing in this war over interpretation into the political sphere. And that's what I see is going on with everybody.
Well, it has to. I mean, because in fact, there is no such thing as a, non-mythological version of things. Mm-hmm. So people are playing out their mythologies in the political sphere, which they always do. Politics is always fundamentally mythological.
Well, then we're at that point where people are tired of being told what their mythology should be. It's a particularly difficult thing with the...
Well, they're told by the bomb, you must believe this one.
Yes, yeah. Relativism.
Right, but it's not a relativism. It's a singular version of the Coca-Cola version of the bomb, of the...
Yep. So we're back in New Mexico.
Yeah.
in the shadow of the bomb, trying to find our mythology.
Well, I think this is an accurate description of the situation. And in this cloud of atomic blast, we will have to leave you to be continued. No, the chat has been enjoying this. At some point, Casey said she's drinking a nuke right now. I guess they don't timestamp these, so I can't tell you when they actually are saying this. In the Mortloaf Bear, I'm glad you've been enjoying this. He says I'm digging this stream. Thanks. Darlin was clueless. The Irish understand. Okay, so this is, and people can't give very long comments either. So I think sometimes these are poetically cryptic. And we like riddles and such. That if nothing else, and I am going to have to make a new cover for this one before we can post it up, because it's not what I thought we were going to talk about. We thought we were going to talk about Theophilus and the contract with the devil, to be continued, right? Next, it'll come. I think
we needed to set up the bomb first to get to that, because it's kind of
we did. This I think the Conquistadora and the atomic bomb is a good juxtaposition to leave people with. That's the shadow of that disruption is what we inhabit right now.
The valley of the shadow of death.
Indeed. Where's your cock when we need it to give us a...
He's probably caught another girlfriend. Oh, well. He's busy now.
Do you end up? I want to say, do you end up with more chickens after that? I mean, does he?
I'm not sure.
Do we actually end up with chicks, little chicks? Life, fertility, off of all of that, so. All of that exuberance of your rooster.
I'm hoping so.
Because of course, death, the destroyer of worlds, is anti-fertility.
Yes.
Okay, so I think we've got a project now. We actually have to explain Christianity properly as a positive claim. We have to explain why the other rabbis are wrong. Oh, goody.
That'll be fun.
What sin is. Yeah, okay, that should keep us going.
Yeah, but hopefully this is explained to people too. If anyone's wondering why I lose it whenever the concept of racial fractions comes into, enters the chat, I'll tap out, because you cannot do rabbi wars when you are in racial fractions. Good luck with that.
Yeah, I think bluntly, actually, I probably have to talk some people through where that came out of in Spain. And I would say those of you who want the preview version of this and some of the reading, my alt history course, the syllabus for that on my homepage will give you some hints. What we in the Mosaic Ark are trying to avoid is the shutdown of conversation that comes when you trigger one of those tripwires that throws up I think it's like they're like boards or something that suddenly spring in front of you and all you can see is the cartoon.
Yes.
And you can't see the complexity or the onion that you are being caught up in. And all you see is the fear and the mask. And we're trying to figure out how to get around that.
Yeah, we all need to talk unafraid together.
And I mean, the sort of emotional situation being we have to be able to say you're wrong and that not be interpreted as meaning we hate you.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's good. That's a program for this year. Okay.
That should keep us going until the next apocalyptic mud rave.
Oh my gosh. Please, Lord, give us the wisdom to navigate this narrative. in our little arc. Yes. Okay. Well, that's all we have for tonight. We're going to keep wittering on because this is a to be continued. Bye. Good night.